Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today I have another one of these free-form episodes. I'm still not quite sure what to call these yet. If you have any ideas, leave something in the comments down below. But for now, I think I'm just going to call it Multifaceted. I want to look at a particular card in detail and try to understand both how it may impact your deck building and how it may impact the game around the card after you play it. Now, last week we talked a little bit about a particular stax effect which is very powerful in CDH, but less powerful at less powerful tables, that being the effect of Rule of Law and similar cards. I promised at the end of that episode that I would talk about one of my favorite stax effects to bring to lower powered tables, one which I mentioned had a pretty low heat index and was very unlikely to draw me a lot of unwanted attention at the table after I cast them. And that effect is Kismet. Kismet dates all the way back to the early stages of the game. Kismet is 3 and a white for an enchantment that says, artifacts, creatures, and lands played by your opponents enter the battlefield tapped. This effect is fairly expensive at 4 mana, forcing everything your opponents put into play, basically all relevant permanents, to enter the battlefield tapped. The most obvious impact it has is on creatures. Kismet prevents creatures from being able to block on the turn that they're cast, essentially giving them a form of summoning sickness on defense. Where it becomes particularly powerful, though, is the effect that it has on both artifacts and lands. In Commander, these are usually both our main sources of mana. Our ability to get powerful lands, which can produce multiple colors of mana, and artifacts, which can both fix our mana and ramp us ahead, particularly when we are outside of green. At 4 mana, Kismet usually does come down a little bit too late to be really effective at most tables. Instead, we often look to lower mana values to find equally powerful and slightly more focused versions of this effect. Now, I've loaded up here a Scryfall search, and as you can see, I did a search for cards with the Oracle text, enter the battlefield tapped. In this case, I'm going to be looking for different enchantments and creatures and artifacts that have that effect. You see good old Kismet right down here, originally printed all the way back in Legends, but it has been iterated on a few different times. We have a color-shifted version of it from Planar Chaos in blue, where it simply does the exact same thing at the same mana value, but we also see it played primarily in white. We've seen fairly recently the card Archon of Emeria, a favorite of mine which combines both a Rule of Law effect and a Kismet effect for non-basic lands that only affect our opponents. This actually gets to one of the reasons why I really like Kismet effects at lower power tables. The reason being, at lower power tables, you're more likely to see enter the battlefield tapped lands on those non-basics anyway. Essentially, this allows people who are at a lower power level relative to the rest of the table, particularly with a less efficient mana base, to be playing on more equal footing. From your standpoint, when you're the one playing this card, you're probably the only person who's going to be playing as quote-unquote Richard Garfield intended, being able to both play and use your lands on the same turn that you do it. It slows down the people who have a larger investment in the game, so to speak, the people who are more likely to be playing the more expensive dual lands, for example. Archon of Emeria is also nice just because it's on a body. It is a 2/3 with flying, so it is a nice evasive attacker. This card sees play in CDH for a reason. Swings in for Tymna, can draw you cards, can make your opponent's non-basic lands, which, quite frankly, is almost every land in CDH, enter the battlefield tapped. The primary effect of it in CDH is obviously the Rule of Law effect, something that, as I already said, is less powerful outside of the CDH metagame. But there are other cards which I think are also very, very powerful. When Manglehorn came out, for example, 2 and a green for a 2/2 creature beast, when it enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact, and artifacts your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. I already mentioned a moment ago that one of the reasons why I really like the effect of Kismet for Archon of Emeria, forcing non-basic lands to enter the battlefield tapped, Manglehorn does the same thing for artifacts. Over the past year, we've seen Treasure pushed increasingly as a powerful way to ramp out mana in colors like red. Particularly on the back of something like Dockside Extortionist, Manglehorn's effect of blocking people from being able to use that mana immediately is especially powerful. When this first came out, I saw it as a primarily upgraded Reclamation Sage. It's not quite true. Reclamation Sage can hit both artifacts and enchantments. Only being able to hit artifacts is a significant limitation on what Manglehorn is capable of, but the ability to also slow down later mana rocks, forcing them to enter the battlefield tapped, that is still a very potent effect, and one I'm still very fond of. In green, we have another version of this in Root Maze. Root Maze is a single green mana for an enchantment, which reads artifacts and lands enter the battlefield tapped. So for the low cost of a single mana, we get a card which essentially stops our opponents from being able to ramp ahead, at the downside of affecting us as well. The fact that this is a green card which affects lands is a little bit on the painful side. If you are primarily on a mana dork strategy though, this is a great way to get ahead, forcing your opponents to slow down and have all their lands enter tapped and all their artifacts enter tapped, while you are using dorks which essentially have the same drawback. Since they have summoning sickness, you can't tap them for mana on the turn that you cast them. There have been a number of other versions of this effect. One of the ones I've been fond of recently is Thalia Heretic Cathar. Similar to Archon of Emeria, she forces non-basic lands your opponents control to enter the battlefield tapped, but she also has the classic Kismet effect of forcing creatures to enter the battlefield tapped if they're cast by your opponents. She's also on a relatively useful body, a 3/2 with First Strike for 3 mana. Creatures entering the battlefield tapped are going to be much more detrimental of an effect at a table that is more battlecruisery. I've done some reading recently, particularly with Sage of Fables having published a very useful document on a deck building and deck rating rubric. At some point, I want to go into greater detail on that because they did really good work there, and I think that this could be something as a big potential boon to the community. Sage, if you're listening, I'd really like to collaborate with you more on what you have there. I think what you have is excellent, and I'm going to steal one of your ideas to talk about a little bit more. In their document, Sage described a battlecruiser type metagame, where games are primarily won on the ground through combat damage during the combat step. Thalia is useful in those games, forcing your opponents to have their potential blockers enter the battlefield tapped, giving a more aggressive game plan and edge to be able to get in and deal damage. Thalia further supports that aggressive game plan by forcing opponents' non-basic lands to enter the battlefield tapped. Again, the reason I like this is it's an equalizing effect. Opponents who are on more basic land-based mana bases. For example, someone who is just binder building or using their small collection that they've opened in packs to build their first decks, they are going to lean most heavily on basic lands, where people who are building more powerful decks are usually going to be looking towards non-basics to get an additional layer of consistency in the form of dual lands or utility lands out of their mana base. Thalia hits the people who have more non-basics harder. And again, that reinforces the more aggressive game plan that Thalia seems to push for. Another effect within white that I have not used much of, but I actually quite like the look of the more that I see it, is Due Respect. Now, this more closely resembles something like Silence, where it is a one-time effect. Essentially, 2 mana, instant permanents enter the battlefield tapped this turn. This is almost a counterspell that white would have access to when someone is trying to go off with something like Dockside Extortionist. It can also stop effects like Avenger of Zendikar from taking over the game, but it's most powerful when someone is trying to go off with a treasure-based win condition. I'm not sure it really deserves to see play too much, but that effect is very unique. White is the primary color for these Kismet effects, having a cantrip effect built onto it to allow you to draw a card after you cast it. I think this is potentially unique space that we could see built around in the future as white continues to develop. There have been a few other cards, and I think one of the main limiting factors to some of them seeing play is their cost. Loxodon Gatekeeper, for example, is a powerful effect. It is just Kismet. Artifacts, creatures, and lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. There's no limitation here on non-basic lands, it is all lands. But, like Kismet, it costs 4 mana to get out, meaning it is often coming into play after your opponents have already established their initial ramp. There are other effects that are a little bit cheaper, like Orb of Dreams, but in this case, for 3 mana, this artifact has all permanents enter the battlefield tapped, meaning that it is not going to be one-sided. There's also a few potential commanders who have similar effects. I already mentioned Thalia. I'm not sure she makes a lot of sense as the primary commander of a deck. But we have Urbarask the Hidden, who I have built around before. At 5 mana, 3 red, this legendary creature, Phyrexian Praetor, is a 4/4. It gives all creatures you control haste and has all creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. Again, making for a potential powerful commander for an aggressive strategy, particularly when these more aggressive strategies are often running into problems around turns 4 and 5 when their opponents are able to get blockers onto the field. We also have Redain, God of the Worthy. This is one of those modal double-faced cards that we saw come out in Kaldheim. On the front side, Redain is 2 and a white for a 2/3 legendary creature god with flying and vigilance. Snow lands your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, and non-creature spells your opponents cast with a mana value of 4 or greater cost 2 more to cast. I actually think on Redain, the Kismet effect is the weaker of the two. The second clause of having non-creature spells your opponents cast with a mana value of 4 or greater cost 2 more to cast, that is potentially much more impactful, as this is going to slow down wrath effects, for example, at more casual tables. It'll slow down some of the more powerful game-breaking ramp effects, and some of the more powerful instants and sorceries are also going to be hindered by this. On the backside, we have a legendary artifact, Volkmira, Protector's Shield, 3 and a white for a legendary artifact. If a source an opponent controls would deal damage to you or a permanent you control, prevent 1 of that damage. And whenever you or another permanent you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter that ability unless its controller pays 1. Both of those effects are actually pretty nice. So Redain gives a lot of potential options here. I think the Kismet effect is the least interesting part of Redain, and every time I read the card, I kind of find a new facet that I like. Maybe at some point I need to come back and do an episode just on her after I've read about her a little bit more. Now, one of the cards that has been making a lot of headlines in CEDH recently has been Blind Obedience. This card already sees quite a bit of play outside of CEDH and more casual tables, primarily for the Extort effect. But the Kismet effect on this card is also fairly powerful. Again, this is going to be hitting artifacts and creatures. It misses lands, so land-based ramp strategies can still get ahead. Probably one of the reasons why people don't always consider Blind Obedience as such a powerful stax effect. But hitting artifacts is especially powerful. I played a CEDH game a few months ago where I was on my Malcolm Kedis deck. That deck relies on a game-winning combo where I'm going to generate infinite amounts of artifacts in the form of treasures off of a combination between Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator and Glinthorn Buccaneer. I'm essentially going to machine gun down the table. If my artifacts, my treasures, enter the battlefield tapped, such as off the back of a Blind Obedience, I literally can't win the game with my combo. Instead, I'm going to sit there and wallow until I find a way to remove Blind Obedience. Blind Obedience has the additional upside of having an extort trigger on it, of whenever you cast a spell, you may pay either white or black. If you do, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain that much life. Extort was written during the Return to Ravnica block before R&D really had their head around multiplayer mechanics. The last vestige of this we saw was with Grey Merchant of Asphodel, where you gained that much life. The more modern templating is each opponent would lose 1 life and you would gain 1 life, rather than the amount of life you gained or the amount of resources you gained being equal to the amount of damage you dealt. The new templating is a lot more limited. That said, the card is printed and you can take advantage of it. If you're playing a lot of cheap spells and you are in white, it's not too hard to be able to use this as a way to drain your opponents down slowly in a death by 1,000 paper cuts style of deck. The last card I'm really going to talk about today is one that I am brewing around currently, and that is Arkellos, Lagoon Mystic. This was one of the cards where people were asking, why isn't this a white card? Arkellos is 1 black, green, blue for a legendary creature Turtle Shaman, a 2/4. As long as Arkellos is tapped, other permanents enter the battlefield tapped. And as long as Arkellos is untapped, other permanents enter the battlefield untapped. Essentially, Arkelos is a universal Kismet effect. Everybody will be affected by it. But in order to reach that point, you need to get Arkelos to be tapped. Traditionally, this means being able to attack in, which with the 2/4 is not particularly easy to do. Most likely, if an opponent wants to get rid of Arkelos, they can sacrifice some creatures and blocks in order to do so. There have been a couple of different builds with Arkelos, people exploring, for example, with Opposition and Enchantment for 2 and blue, which reads, tap an untapped creature you control, tap target artifact, creature, or land. So you would simply tap down Arkelos to tap down someone's mana rock or someone's creature, really whatever you needed to tap, and then from that point on, every permanent that enters the battlefield is going to come into play tapped. It's not very relevant for enchantments or planeswalkers, obviously, but that doesn't really matter. You're going to be hitting all lands, all artifacts. Arkelos being in the command zone does potentially draw additional heat. I think you can primarily avoid that heat by telling people, look, I'm not on stasis, I'm not on Winter Orb. You will get to untap, but you're going to be spending your first turn tapped down. My plan with this is actually to make it a deck where I'm going to have a companion alongside Arkelos. Karuga the Macro Sage, 3 and Hybrid Simic for a 5/4 legendary creature Dino Hippo. This companion rule is you have to have only cards with a mana value of 3 or greater and land cards. And when Karuga the Macro Sage enters the battlefield, draw a card for each other permanent you control with a mana value of 3 or greater. Shoutouts to Nathan the Hermit Druid, as I know he is a big fan of Karuga and has been pushing for more people to try this companion out. This will be my attempt to do so. But that about wraps up my thoughts on Kismet. These types of effects are a very powerful and honestly still somewhat underused effect in Commander. They're starting to see more play in CDH, and I think they should see more play at casual tables too. My primary thesis here, very simple. Your ability to limit the fastest decks at the table is going to benefit you. And if you happen to be on an aggressive game plan, well, it's a great way to limit what your opponents are doing, limit their ability to stop you when you go on an aggressive swing, and get ahead of your opponents when they are trying to ramp ahead with artifact ramp and land ramp. Let us know what you think. Leave us a comment on YouTube, where we are Gemstone Mine Podcast. You can add us on Twitter, where we are Gemstone Mine MTG, or you can send us an email at gemstoneminepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mine.